Good morning. It's Wednesday, November 20th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 411 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. The Israelis continue to conduct raids in Lebanon, and they continue to find Russian arms. To some extent, this was all predictable. Russia sells lots of weapons to non-Western countries, and it sells weapons to Iran, which is the patron of Hezbollah. But the sheer amount of Russian weaponry has reportedly surprised the Israelis, and it's beginning to prompt Israelis to reconsider the role of Russia in the region. Of course, the Kremlin isn't neutral, never was. It's a top patron of Iran, and it also sustains an alliance with China, Russia, and even North Korea. This is an axis of aggressors that is threatening the American-led world order. The sooner we all understand this, the better off we'll be. But this is not news to you, even if you only tune in occasionally to the FDD Morning Brief. It's important to see the world as it is, not as we want it to be. Today's guest is Gary Osen. He's the managing partner of the law firm Osen LLC. His firm has been involved in a number of anti-terrorism lawsuits over the years, targeting the financial institutions that have enabled the activities of Hamas, Hezbollah, the IRGC, Al-Qaeda, and more. Osen's clients have won more than $1 billion since compensation and compensatory judgments against Iran, Syria, and North Korea. As far as I'm concerned, Gary is doing the Lord's work in the courtroom, and he's at it again, teaming up this time with a handful of other law firms to target Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and other terror groups for the attacks of 10/7. We'll speak to Gary in just a few minutes right here on the FDD Morning Brief. They say every dog has his day. Well, Amos Hochstein, the Biden administration's envoy for energy, has been working like a dog to broker a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. If the news is accurate, he just might have his day. Hochstein delivered a draft ceasefire agreement to the government of Lebanon, or whatever we call this caretaker regime, controlled by Hezbollah. Yesterday, Beirut responded positively with a few gaps to bridge. Lots has to happen, and lots can still go wrong. But the fighting in the north may soon come to an end. This is good news for those of us who feared a catastrophic war between Hezbollah and Israel, but it does raise questions about Gaza. Nobody is talking about a ceasefire there. Nobody's talking about a hostage deal either. There's a good chance that the guns go silent in the north while a low-level insurgency continues in Gaza. Israel can handle this militarily, but the Israeli people continue to suffer trauma from the hostage crisis, and the rest of the Middle East simply cannot achieve stability so long as Gaza remains a war zone. Hamas knows this, and so do Hamas's patrons in Iran, Qatar, and Turkey. The future of the Middle East now hinges on their willingness to force their client to stand down, and they don't seem interested. I've said it since the beginning of the war. I'll say it again. Hamas's patrons are ultimately the problem. It's time we hold all three of them to account. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the U.S. Treasury Department imposed sanctions on 6 Hamas leaders and financiers. 3 of them are based in Turkey. This trio includes a longtime member of Hamas who was involved in a 1997 suicide bombing at a cafe in Tel Aviv that killed multiple civilians. The other 2 Turkey-based targets are involved in the transfer of funds to Gaza and the West Bank. Oh, and they've both been convicted for murdering Israelis. Treasury also slapped sanctions on 3 Hamas leaders in Gaza. Their names are Mohammed Nazal, Bassem Naim, and Ghazi Hamad. Nazal and Naim are members of Hamas's Council on International Relations. Hamad is a member of Hamas's Politburo and effectively serves as the terrorist group's chief spokesman. He's the guy that went on TV after October 7th and vowed to repeat the slaughter repeatedly until Israel is annihilated. Headline 2, speaking of Turkey, the Biden administration warned Ankara against welcoming Hamas. At a press briefing on Monday, State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said that while he couldn't confirm or deny reports that Hamas officials are relocating from Qatar to Turkey, the administration will make clear to the Turkish government that there can be no more business as usual with Hamas. The next day, a spokesperson from the Qatari Foreign Ministry said that Hamas negotiators are no longer in Doha, but that the terror group's Qatar office hasn't permanently closed. All this talk about where Hamas officials may or may not be doesn't change the fact that Turkey and Qatar are both sponsors of the terror group and both are somehow still recognized as allies by the United States. That's got to change. Being part of the U.S. alliance structure should come with minimal standards. Not supporting terrorist groups should be chief among them. And headline 3, a barrage of 8 rockets hit the headquarters of Italy's UNIFIL contingent in southern Lebanon. The rockets did not make a direct impact, and Italy's defense ministry did not report any injuries. That said, 5 Italian soldiers were sent to the base's medical facility for monitoring. But here's where it gets weird. At first, Italy's defense minister blamed Israel. Then, hours later, Italy walked that back. Rome said that the defense minister didn't have the right information when he pointed his finger at Israel, and that Hezbollah was actually responsible for the attack. Italy is one of 48 countries that contributes troops to the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, also known as UNIFIL. UNIFIL is supposed to keep southern Lebanon Hezbollah free. Obviously, that's been an abject failure, and the peacekeeping force is starting to crack. Yesterday, Argentina announced that it's pulling its troops from UNIFIL. I don't see why any country would want to support this mission when you consider how little it has accomplished over the decades and the dangers that are now posed by Hezbollah. All right, our guest on today's program is Gary Osen. As I mentioned, Gary is a lawyer that wages legal battles against terrorist organizations and rogue states. Together with a gaggle of other like-minded lawyers, Gary has just filed a new complaint. His targets are Iran, the IRGC, Hezbollah, and Hamas, among others. This was just filed on Monday, and there's lots to unpack. So we're going to talk to him about that case live right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the show, Gary Osen.
Good morning, John. How are you?
Doing great. All right, I want to start with a little bit about you and your law firm, Osen LLC. You guys are not your typical law firm. Maybe just share with our audience who you have sued in the past and some of the better outcomes that have resulted.
Sure. So my law firm represents American victims of terrorism who've been killed or injured anywhere around the world. So that includes Americans who were killed in the Second Intifada by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. It includes the families of Christian missionaries who were kidnapped and murdered by the FARC in Colombia. But it also includes hundreds of families, Gold Star families, American soldiers who were targeted by the IRGC and Hezbollah in Iraq, aid workers in Afghanistan, pretty much across the globe.
It's terrific work, and obviously I've been following it and in some cases helping out where I can. And you should be commended for continuing to do this, because it's often not as lucrative for lawyers to do this kind of work. And I think folks don't typically understand that. But now to the case at hand. What are the basic facts of this case? Who's doing the suing? Who's getting sued?
So we represent, along with our colleagues, the gaggle of lawyers, that is to say, Jenner and Block, Stein Mitchell, and Motley Rice. We've come together to represent 36 families from October 7th and from the ensuing conflict in Gaza and in the north with Hezbollah. These are families of American citizens who were killed or injured over the last 400 plus days. And we've sued Iran and what Iran terms its axis of resistance, which is to say Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, and also Hezbollah, of course. So the complaint really tries to shed some new light on the Iranian central role in facilitating the October 7th attacks and everything that has followed since.
It's so interesting. You mentioned PFLP in there. I think it's just not widely understood that this is a Marxist-Leninist organization that gets assistance from the Islamic Republic of Iran. You wouldn't necessarily pair the Islamic Republic with a communist type of organization. And yet it's part of this axis. I'm glad to see that they're included in there. And of course, we've seen a charity in Canada shut down for PFLP ties and sanctioned by the United States. That's a terror group that doesn't get a lot of attention here, should get more. But let me ask you about the money itself. I mean, how much money are we talking about here? And can we really imagine that funds can be recouped? It's not like the supreme leader of Iran is buying mutual funds here in the United States. I doubt he's got a large holding on the New York Stock Exchange. So how do you go after that money?
So there are two ways that the victims can ultimately recover. The much more straightforward and relatively easy way is once they've obtained a judgment against Iran, they can file a claim with the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund, the US VSST, and that provides an opportunity for them to recoup relatively small amounts, a small percentage of their judgments from the Treasury Department. And those funds are derived from various asset seizures and fines that are paid by corporations around the world who violate US sanctions against state sponsors of terrorism. So a person who has a judgment, for example, for $10 million against Iran may be able to recover with US VSST payments, let's say somewhere between $10,000 and $100,000 every 2 years through the fund, depending on how much money is available at any given time. So that's the relatively straightforward way, and it's an important vehicle, especially for those families for whom the financial compensation is important, for their everyday life. On the other hand, the larger challenge for us is to try and attach assets of Iran around the world. My firm has tried to do that in the past. Our colleagues, I mentioned Jenner and Block, have attached over $1 billion that's currently frozen in Luxembourg. In another case, we work together as a group in the past, and will do so here, to try and seize other Iranian assets around the world. It's very difficult because in addition to having to track assets that are not held openly, but it can be done. The real challenge is that the Iranians tend to come in not with legal procedural challenges. They do that too, but they also threaten the governments where the funds are held and make them an offer they can't refuse to release them.
Pretty typical of that regime. I guess I want to ask you here, there are some things that are new that come out in this case that you've just filed in this complaint. You bring to light a few things. They're documents that are arguably newsworthy. Can you explain a little bit about what you found?
Sure. So I think the main takeaway is that, certainly after October 7th, the U.S. administration's position was that Iran clearly supports Hamas generally. That's documented. They've supported them substantially for decades, but that there was no direct evidence that Iran was involved in the planning or financing of the October 7th attacks. And I think the documents that we attached to the complaint put that to rest substantially, because it's clear that Iran had a special channel, sort of a black budget, if you will, separate and apart from all the other money that they were providing regularly to Hamas, that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, had a slush fund basically provided by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that went directly to him with a little bit to Hania as well. And this was the core sort of black budget for the Qassam brigades in Gaza. And more importantly, and this was also reported in the New York Times on Monday, they had a special set aside or request that went out of $7 million a month to fund Sinwar's so-called big project, which was what became the October 7th attack.
Amazing. And actually, Hania being mentioned in there in the same breath with Sinwar is interesting, because, of course, you're going to hear folks say, well, there's a political wing and there's a military wing. I think that would seem to contest that assertion. And I think that's important, too. I've never bought the whole dichotomy between the political and military wings. And I think it sounds like these documents might reinforce that.
I would take that further. You'll see that Hania and Khalil Haya, who's the only one of the three in that group who's still alive, were actively involved in coordinating the planning of the attack. Haya was actually used, even though he's from the political and social wing of Hamas, he was used as the major trusted cutout to deal with the IRGC and Hezbollah in coordinating the military operations in Lebanon.
Fascinating. And Al Haya, as we know, has been based in Qatar of late. Apparently, is on his way to Turkey. Would be very interested to see at some point maybe a case filed against the Turks, but that's a project we can talk about later.
Well, let me jump in 1 second on the documents with that, because there is one document attached to the complaint that references the Qatari and Turkish funding of Hamas, not of the operation itself, but of the Qassam brigades. And there's a complaint actually lodged by one of Hamas's leaders that they haven't been getting their regular flow of money from them. And that's why it's so important that they get a bump in the money they're getting from the IRGC during that short period of time. So we didn't go very deeply into that because the complaint focuses on Iran, but there is certainly a lot of other evidence out there, not just that Qatar and Turkey generally support Hamas, but that they're intimately involved in financing the Qassam brigades, the military apparatus, the terror apparatus of Hamas.
Well, that's interesting. So with that, I think it's probably important for you to get into the law as it relates to suing sovereign states, right? There's some that we can sue and there are others that we can't. If you could explain to our audience why some are all clear for litigation and some are off limits, I think that would be important.
Great. So under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, there's a carve out, the sort of so-called terrorism exception, and it really only applies to a handful of countries that the U.S. State Department designates as state sponsors of terrorism. And that includes Iran, Syria, Cuba, and North Korea at the moment. Sudan was taken off the list when the Abraham Accords were signed. So every other state enjoys sovereign immunity, even if they're engaged in supporting terrorism. So, for example, Qatar and Pakistan, two of my favorites in this field, both of those states clearly have supported terrorist organizations, but because they're not designated as state sponsors, they enjoy the same immunity that Canada does. So that's why you see these lawsuits are almost always against Iran or Syria.
Frustrating, because obviously we've got these countries that are enjoying the perks of American alliance, of Western alliance structures, NATO, et cetera, and they should be held to account. It's really unbelievable. I'd like to see some changes there on that list of state sponsors of terror and begin to hold some of these other patrons of Hamas and perhaps other terrorist groups. It's time to hold them to account. Last question for you, Gary. In the past, you've gone after financial institutions, including banks based here in the United States and in other Western countries. I guess question one is how you justify this legally. And then I think maybe the broader question that might be important for this audience to hear is whether it's easier or harder to win a case against a bank versus a rogue state. I think the answer may surprise some listeners.
Yes, the short answer is it's much harder to sue financial institutions or other commercial parties because, first and foremost, they bring lawyers to the table and they fight those cases for many years very hard. We've sued Arab Bank of Jordan. We had a trial in 2014 that resulted in a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs for 24 Hamas attacks that were committed during the Second Intifada. It's clearly much harder to sue financial institutions or commercial parties, but also because the law is much more challenging in that regard. You have to not only establish that that the defendant has knowingly provided support, but that the support was substantial and that it went through the United States, that there's a U.S. nexus. And so that's the challenge. We have a current lawsuit against 13 Lebanese banks that we allege laundered billions of dollars for Hezbollah. And as we go forward with October 7th, we intend to pursue not just the sovereign Iranian component or the terrorist groups, but also some of the major commercial actors in the Middle East who've helped move the money and helped construct the tunnels and do all the other things that made October 7th possible.
Well, I think we'll need to have you back when you file more complaints and you can let us know what you've found. Gary Osen, I want to thank you very much for joining us this morning on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks for having me.
All right, wish him the best of luck. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Seth Frantzman has a new article in FDD's Long War Journal detailing the IDF's expanding operations in Lebanon. This includes an increase in precision strikes in Beirut targeting Hezbollah members, as well as a broader ground offensive amidst ongoing discussions about that potential Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire. Will Hochstein secure a deal? Will Israel be left with no choice but to continue its offensive against Hezbollah? Or will the Lebanese people finally rise up against the terror group that has been holding them hostage? We'll find out soon enough, I guess. FDD's Mark Dubowitz paired up with Eugene Kontorovich for a New York Post op-ed detailing the Biden administration's truly bizarre sanctions on Israelis in the West Bank. As a former Treasury official, I can't fully convey how Orwellian this is. Once President-elect Donald Trump takes office, he can swiftly revoke these moves. But it's a dangerous precedent being set here, the targeting of civilians in an allied country with the same measures we wield against terrorists, nuclear proliferators, and drug kingpins seems like an overuse of U.S. sanctions, to put it mildly. And finally, be sure to check out my colleague Andrea Stricker's latest policy brief on Russia's likely use of chemical weapons against Ukraine. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, recently conducted a visit to Ukraine and confirmed evidence of chemical weapons use, directly contradicting Moscow's persistent denials. Andrea notes that an upcoming meeting in The Hague, member states will have a critical opportunity to further isolate Russia by removing it from key OPCW leadership positions, thereby diminishing Moscow's malign influence within one more UN agency. That is going to do it for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. We'll feature my friend Joseph Browdy, the head of a great organization called the Center for Peace Communications. You've probably seen some of the videos his shop has produced shedding light on those who live under the shadow of Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's fascinating stuff. It's harrowing stuff. And it's all been featured in places like the Free Press. So please tune in. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer signing off for FDD.